Today we're going to be switching it up from arcade content and actually replacing the motor in this Jeep Cherokee. This thing has been sitting for quite a while now because the motor in it kind of went kaput. And it's time we replace it. I'm actually going to be taking the motor out of this parts Jeep here as well. There's a good motor in it. Funnily enough, it's actually the second motor I've stolen from this Jeep to put into the blue Jeep. When I bought this Jeep originally for 400 bucks, it came with a few things. It came with a motor that supposedly was a crate motor. It also came with the fancy winch and bumper setup that's on the blue Jeep, which ultimately means I did get a decent deal, but then I found out that the frame rails on this thing were, well, by frame rails I mean unibody rails, were bent and cracked right here at the rear axle. So ultimately, I scrapped any projects with trying to repair this thing, also due to a lot of rust. But considering I got this nice bumper, winch, and this motor out of that Jeep, I think the lower control arms off that black Jeep and the springs went on my brother's Jeep, we got a pretty good deal on that thing for only 400 bucks. But this motor has finally blown up, and I really don't think this was a crate motor. It honestly looks like the original motor out of that black Jeep, which means it has 260-some thousand miles on it. Now, the reason I'm stealing another motor out of this black Jeep is because I actually pulled this motor out of a junkyard wrecked Jeep that actually had service records and everything. I'm stupid and didn't grab the service record book when I pulled the motor, but I did look at it and it did have service records, and it was a nice lifted two-door with a manual transmission, which is why I pulled this. It had a AX15 attached to it, which is actually what's attached to it right now. I put it in this Jeep just to make sure it ran and everything. It's time we pull this motor out. I'm not going to be manual swapping the blue Jeep, but I will be pulling all that out. I'm just going to pull the manual transmission. This has manual ECU, manual wiring, manual clutch and everything. So we're going to be pulling all that stuff, and we're going to put that stuff in storage, but this motor is going to be going in that blue Jeep for now. This motor only has 180-some thousand miles, or at least the Jeep it came out of did, and it was wrecked, so obviously this motor probably ran when it wrecked. Luckily, since I just kind of slapped this thing in it once I got it home from the junkyard, not all that much is honestly attached. Obviously wiring is attached, but as you can see, there's no front clip or anything, so it should be pretty simple to get this thing out, and well, then shove this Jeep out and maybe drive the blue one in. It might drive under its own power, it might not. Now, I do actually have plans for this Jeep. Once this drive line's out, I actually want to cut this off at the firewall and actually turn this into a trailer. There's a whole Facebook group of people doing it, and I want to do it because I want to turn this into a cool camper because I think that would look awesome being towed behind another Cherokee. And just like that, the engine is fully detached up here, which means we'll have to go underneath and detach the stuff down there. Ultimately, I'm going to pull the transfer case off and then pull the motor and transmission together. Some people pull all three together, but I think for my sake, I'm going to just pull the transfer case first. That's how I put it in. I put the motor and transmission, and then I put the transfer case in. So we're going to do it that way. I think it's going to be a lot easier. I removed the drive shaft, and by the drive shaft, I mean the front drive shaft. I actually didn't have a rear drive shaft on this, as these are fun to put drive shafts on. See, that just has a slip yoke there. But you can't just slap an automatic transmission drive shaft on it because the manual transmission is a different length. I forget if it's longer or shorter, but because of that, you need the specific manual drive shaft. But you also need that manual drive shaft to match what rear end you have. This is a Chrysler 8.25 in it, which means it needs a different drive shaft than the more common Dana 35, which makes it slightly more difficult to find a drive shaft. Now, the previous owner of this manual transmission had a transfer case with a slip yoke eliminator on it and just ran another front drive shaft here on the back. Unfortunately, that was already taken off when I got to the Cherokee at the junkyard, so I just threw on a random transfer case I had that did not have a slip yoke eliminator, so I was just running a front drive shaft. But if I ever run this transmission in an actual Jeep, I'll put a slip yoke eliminator on this and just run a front drive shaft as the rear drive shaft as well. And the reason people will run a front drive shaft as the rear is because the front drive shafts have the slippage in the actual drive shaft itself. Currently, I have the normal jack holding up the transmission. Normally, you'd use the transmission jack to hold up the transmission, but we're going to use the transmission jack to lower the transfer case down. But first, we have to take this crossbar off, which is why I have the transmission being held up by that jack there. Let's take this off. As you can see, somebody has done some shit here and added a weird spacer really crappily welded on. So hopefully these bolts unthread. Now I'm going to drain the transmission fluid because, as I learned last time, if you don't... Whenever you take off the transfer case, that will pour out the rear of it. Especially when you go to tilt it to pull it out of the Jeep. So let's hope to keep as much of this off the floor as I can. Now I didn't fully let it drain because I do want some oil to sit in this transmission. And I just drained it enough that hopefully the rest of it won't pour out whenever we tilt this transmission up. Now, the fun part is I have to unbolt this transfer case from the transmission. As you can see, I got the easy two out. One came with the whole stud and one didn't. I'm honestly not sure how the hell I got these on. I'm assuming I have to lower the transmission down and I can get to the ones on top. I don't remember how I did this. It's been like a year or two. I accidentally forgot that you have to remove the interior stuff. I don't remember how you do that. Is this just a pull-on knob? What the hell? Okay, that's not coming off. Let's hope I don't need to take it off. Ultimately, all I need to do is push this ring down, I believe. It's been a while. I don't 100% remember how to do this. Yeah, and then I gotta rotate it. I'm not sure which direction. And then I can just take this whole gear shift knob out, handle and all. Okay, it was counterclockwise, and I think I need to twist it a little bit more, or not. Maybe. There we go. Perfect. That's what we want to see. Now we can drop the transmission without an issue. Now, I believe I can lower the transmission down enough to get to the bolts on the top of the transfer case. Just like that. Perfect. There they are. And now that we have the transfer case out, it is time to pull the motor and transmission. This should be everything fully detached, except for obviously the motor mounts, but we'll have to get an engine hoist on this thing and lift this bad boy out. And it is out. So now I have to figure out how to separate these two. I actually have no idea how to do that. I've never done it. So we're gonna have to do that and then shove this Jeep out and we'll be done. And there we go. Transmission is off. It is fully disconnected. All the fancy manual stuff are on there. Apparently even the cover is manual specific because it doesn't have an access panel. But we are off, throw out bearings out. We are good to go, almost. Technically everything electrical in this has to be replaced because this is a 96, and while they switched to OBD2 in 96, 97, when they did the body change, they changed every single connector to a different style connector. They have the same amount of pins, there's just a different style. So we're gonna have to swap all of the electrical stuff from the other motor on, but I pulled off a bunch of the stuff, but once we get the other motor out, we'll just directly swap over the stuff that needs swapped over. Now this fun Jeep is in the garage, and now it's time to rip this one down. It's gonna be a bit more complicated, as this front bumper is absolutely massive and is very much bolted way back into the frame. I see way too many people build fancy custom bumpers like this. This one's not actually custom, this one's actually by a company, and then mount it on their Jeep using the factory bumper mounts. Seriously? I'll show you how stupid that is. The factory bumper mounts that I see a lot of people use are these 3 bolts right here. This is all that held the original front bumper on, because, well, the front bumper originally didn't weigh anything, it's not meant to have any weight on it. These 2 bolts don't even do anything because all they're in is a little bit of sheet metal. Just a thin piece of sheet metal. So the only one that actually really does anything is this one right here, which is just a bolt in the frame. The rest of these, as you can see, if you buy a real bumper, or at least these brackets to make your bumper a real bumper, tie way back into the frame rails. These actually bolt into the steering box and everything. This is way back into the frame rail. If this rips off, it does a ton of damage, but also, it's not going to rip off. If you rip this off, you've got bigger issues. I've lifted the entire front of this Jeep up with this front bumper, absolutely no issues. If you don't have your bumpers actually tie back into the frame, well, you're just going to rip it off. There's no point. You're never going to get the full weight out of your winch without ripping it off. Don't believe me that people are seriously that stupid. This is an absolutely massive bumper that I got with some other Jeep stuff I bought, and as you can see, it's got a winch plate, it's got a front receiver, and they use the stock 3 bolts. Seriously? The stock 3 bolts, that's all you're going to use? And, like, the third hole is so tiny, I don't even think you can put a full size of the original bolt in there. That's a really tiny bolt. That is not going to hold anything, let alone a winch, let alone a front receiver. This bumper is basically just decorative. I mean, obviously you can argue that these bumpers are stupid anyway, and I honestly would partially agree, but there's no real good way to attach a winch without them. I also make similar things for these rear bumpers. If you have a rear hitch on your bumper, which I'd never use, I mean, I use the factory one obviously because that's actually rated. They actually have tie-in bars that actually go into the frame rails as well. I don't have it for mine. I should, because I do have a tire on the back. I'll probably buy those and get those on here, but yeah, don't just use the factory bumper mounts if you're putting well more weight than the factory bumper was ever meant to hold. The fun part is this bumper is like probably a 50, 60, 70 pound bumper, and that winch is another 60, 70, 80, 90 pound winch. So this is quite heavy. The next problem is this bumper weighs more than I should reasonably lift, so that's where this comes in. Honestly, I'm not going to break my back trying to lift this by myself. And there we go, one ridiculously overweight bumper off. Now we get to do the rest of this. All this is going to be very similar to how it was on the last Jeep, so I'm probably not going to show too much, but I just got to tear this thing down to the motor. And not pull the transmission this time. There we go. Motor is about out. All that's still attached is the obvious transmission to the thing. That's going to be a real pain. I'm really hoping I didn't tighten those e-torques down very tight when I put this thing in. And the exhaust and motor mounts. I believe everything else, except for that ground strap, that bolt is of course just spinning, so we're going to have to pull it off the head, which we'll do once we pull it out a little bit so I can actually get to that bolt easier. That'll probably be the last thing that's disconnected, but everything else is pretty much disconnected. As you can see, there's a bunch more stuff in this engine bay than last time because I just stripped the engine last time. This time I want to actually keep some stuff in here because, well, I'm putting a new motor back in here. Now we have the fun task of taking off these 4 bolts that mount the flex plate to the torque converter. Luckily, I have a good bit of experience with this. Basically, just put a wrench to keep the crankshafts from spinning and kind of twist them off with a wrench. If you're lucky, they should come right out. Whenever you put these back in, make sure you Loctite them or they will work themselves loose again and it will sound like you have rod knock. Now, pro tip, maybe not that much Loctite. That took a crow's foot and a 2-foot bar. That was ridiculous. Let's hope the rest of these come out a little bit easier. And with that, this whole motor is completely unbolted. Even the engine mount bolts are undone. They're just resting on the bolts. So tomorrow, this engine's coming out. Now, we need to convert this 93/96 motor over to this 98. Now, I say 93/96 because it's a 96 motor, but I put it on a 93. I don't think I had to change anything for that, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Pretty sure I didn't. Even though 96 is OBD2, they didn't actually change much of anything until 97 when they changed the new body style. So we need to change a lot of stuff from this 98 over to this one here. Also, this is not technically a 98 motor. It was converted to a 98 motor previously. So that obviously is not a 98 top. But that needs to be swapped. That needs to be swapped. Basically, all of that needs to be swapped. All of that needs to be... anything electric needs to be swapped. While the intake manifold is the same, we're actually going to probably swap them. I'm not sure. I mean, otherwise I'd have to switch all of these electronic connectors over, and I really don't want to do that. But we do have to switch this exhaust pipe. The 98s, or I think 97s too, maybe, had these flexible joints here in the exhaust manifold that the old ones didn't. And, well, this one's not cracked, and that one is. Basically, all of the headers that I've seen that don't have this stuff have been cracked. I don't actually know if these affects the cracks, because usually it's cracked down here, but this one's not cracked, so that one's going on there. Every other one of these headers I've seen has been cracked, so it's pretty much a miracle that this one isn't. And there we go, the exhaust manifold, intake, and power steering pump are off. Luckily, no bolts broke off, though I usually don't have any break off in the exhaust manifold in these 4.0s. I say that now, since I take that one off. I've never had that exhaust manifold off that one, so who knows? I have had it off this one before. That might be why. But also, I had to remove the power steering pump. It makes it easier to get the exhaust manifold off. Also, we have to switch it. This motor does have a new water pump on it, but we're not going to swap that. That takes too much time. And that water pump should probably be good. And, well, to be fair, this motor is overheated with that one, so who knows if that one's even still good. But we do need that fan here. This is an upgraded, I think it's a ZJ fan or something, whatever the hell the Grand Cherokee is. It's slightly better than the factory one, pushes a little bit more air. It's way louder, but it pushes a little bit more air, which is kind of nice in a lifted Jeep that, well, uses a lot more power and a lot more torque to actually move. So we're going to swap these two out as well. Now, when I said everything electrical, I meant everything electrical. Even the alternator needs to be changed, as what connects it is different. See, this one uses a connector and a bolt, while the earlier alternators just used a bunch of bolts. There is no connectors. And next, the ignition. That's going to have to change the coil. This thing, I'm pretty sure the whole thing has to change, but I know for a fact at least this has to change, and I believe up. But that has to change. I think that's everything on this side, just this electrical stuff right here. Now it's time to strip everything off of this motor that we need to switch over. And I actually was wrong. You do have to switch this over because the the power steering pump mount is different. This uses a weird 3-bolt setup, while this one just uses a 1-bolt setup. So this definitely does have to change, though we're going to change it anyway, so that really doesn't change anything. I've already taken all the bolts, so this should, in theory, pull right off. It is proceeding to not do that, so maybe I missed a bolt, but let's get this thing stripped down. I took apart both distributors and verified they are the exact same. Well, at least at this part, they're the exact same, so there's no reason to switch to this base, which is good, because otherwise I'd have to line up the cylinders and line this thing up and time it all, which there's no need to do, since we can just reuse that one and just slap the new stuff on top of it. Now, I'd like to make this thing look a little bit less like a 30-year-old Jeep motor, so let's get this thing cleaned up before we go any further. I want to probably scrub down, make it so there's not so much caked on oil, maybe throw some paint on the rust so it doesn't rust out, and I should be good to go. But first, let's get this thing a bath. So I ended up degreasing, and then I ended up painting this side with some super high temp paint. I think it's rated for 2,000 degrees, so that should be plenty. Mainly because we were getting some surface rust right here, because apparently this section wasn't leaking any oil, so I decided I didn't want that to rust, especially those freeze plugs, so we should be good to go. I also pulled off a bunch of the brackets to get them powder coated, so they should be getting done right now, and it's about time to put everything back on this motor so we can put it back in the Jeep. Everything should be on this that I'm putting on it right now, actually except for the flywheel, I gotta put that on, but other than that, everything is on, so this is now a 97 motor. Now with this motor fully set back up, it's time to put it into this Jeep, so let's get started. I found one more difference between the automatic and manual transmissions. The automatic transmission, these guide pegs are in the transmission side, and on the automatic transmission, on the manual transmission, they're on the motor side. So now I have to pull those out of this motor because this was a manual motor, because I have been fighting for about an hour trying to get this thing to line up with the transmission, but it can't, because I have two pegs fighting each other to go into, well, where the other peg is. The engine is finally bolted to the transmission and torque converter bolts are bolted on. Now, pro tip, if you have a transmission drop like this Jeep has, take that off and jack the transmission up to the correct height, because then it'll actually be in the correct angle for the motor and it'll be a whole lot easier to get everything lined up. I haven't had issues before with these Jeeps, but this one took hours to get this goddamn motor lined up with that stupid transmission. It was slightly crooked, and getting it straightened out was insanely difficult. We need like a four-way version of this so you can go front and back and side to side. But obviously I don't have one of those, and I don't even know if they make them. But it is in. Oh my goodness, that was difficult. So we still have the bolts on top of the motor transmission. Those will be fun. Those ones aren't too big of a deal. There's plenty of wriggle room. They'll line up just fine. The engine mounts aren't fully bolted in. They're just kind of sitting in there. So this is not actually holding any weight. So, well, it actually might be lifting the whole Jeep up. I don't know. I'm tired. It's been a while. And now the engine is in. Some stuff has changed, obviously. We now have the radiator in, the radiator support, all that fun stuff's in. It's all wired up. I still need to get a belt from town because I forgot to get one of those. And I also need to get an oil pressure sensor because the wiring harness is apparently for a 99 or 2000, as it has the 3-pin oil pressure sensor. Well, all other years use 1 or 2 pins. So we're gonna have to get a new oil pressure sensor. I assume that still works with the dash. I'm not sure. I don't know why this 99 wiring harness is in here. This is one hell of a Frankenstein Jeep. But it's time to put this grill on. And just like that, the grill is on. Now we gotta put this stupid heavy bumper back on it, which will be really fun to do, and wire it all back up. And we'll just need a few more parts, and this thing will be ready to fire up. Looking at this 92 Jeep is when I realized I fucked up. I put the wrong belt stuff on. I somehow put the old generation belt stuff on instead of the new generation. That motor apparently already had the new generation stuff, and my old motor had the wrong stuff. I don't know. It's, again, a Frankenstein Jeep. We're going to keep it with the old style. It works good enough. We're just going to have to remember to buy the serpentine belt for the pre-change. Awesome. At least I figured that out before I bought a new belt. And with all of that now on, we are doing some simple maintenance. I'm changing oil, changing the oil filter. We got to refill the coolant. I had to refill the power steering pump fluid because we dumped all that out. And we'll have to grab a battery in this thing and see if this thing will fire up. But first, I got to finish changing oil. So apparently, pro tip, if you get a motor out of a junkyard, make sure you can get the goddamn oil filter off before you put the motor in the Jeep. Holy shit, that was difficult to get off. What the fuck? Who the hell put an impact on this bitch? I mean, it's a Champion oil filter, so what do you expect? But what the fuck? That took like an hour to get off. That was ridiculous. I think I sprained my thumb. There we go. Oil's in. Radiator fluid's in. Let's slap a battery in this thing and see if she starts up. It freaking better. Moment of truth. That didn't sound great. Alright, now we're smoothing out. Thank goodness. I was getting kind of concerned there. Besides for a little bit of smoke from all the oil and gunk I spilled, this thing is running really smoothly. No weird noises. It's running, its RPM's a little bit high right now, but I don't have that vacuum line hooked up and that'll knock some of that down. So I'd say we're golden. Hell yeah. And we are done. This thing drives, it runs really well. So I'd say we're done. If you like this, please like and subscribe. I do have a few more cars I need to work on. I also need to move back onto arcade machines, but cars are fun. They have issues, and I buy a lot of issued cars. So I got a wrecked Audi, I got to rebuild, and I got another Audi with a clutch issue. So that'll be a fun engine out job. So, well, see you in the next one.